for investigations as agreed at the London Assembly plenary meeting on the 6th of June?
Agreed.
Thank you. Item 4 is the summary list of actions. Can we note the list of actions set out in the agenda?
Noted.
And item 5, which is our main item of business today, is the Old Oak and Park Royal Development Corporation risks. So I'd like to welcome our guests. Firstly, Liz Pearce, the Chair of the OPDC, David Lunts, who is the Interim Chief Executive of the OPDC, and Jasbir, Sandhu, who's the Interim Chief Finance Officer. Welcome to all three of you. First time we've met since the HIF grant of £250 million back in March, I think, of this year. So I suppose we ought to start off really by talking about what you're going to be spending that money on. I don't know if that would be you, Liz, would kick off on that?
Well, I thought it might be helpful, Chairman, if I just sort of gave you a brief statement of where we are, starting with the HIF news. I think it'd probably be fair to say we are at quite a challenging point in our history in OPDC. Yes, we received a very favourable announcement in March. We were all absolutely delighted about that. Some 6 months after we'd actually put our HIF bid in, so it had taken an awful lot of time. The HIF bid doesn't mean we've actually got the money in the bank. The actual announcement then was followed up by an exchange of correspondence which sets a number of very challenging conditions that we have to meet until we actually get the money. So, as I say, we are quite a long way from having a bankable pot of expenditure. We know, for the moment, this is going to lead us to an interesting problem in year, because until we actually get the money, we haven't got the means to sort of pay the things we need to do to get the sort of HIF bid progressing. So there is likely to be some element of shortfall in year, and I'll talk about that again in a moment, and that's something where we've been in discussion with the GLA about underwriting that. Now, one of the conditions in the HIF bid is around having an accepted local plan. The local plan for OPDC has been through a number of, I think, 3 consultations in all, and is now going through its examination in public. As I'm sure some of you will be aware, it is regrettably being challenged by a major landowner in the area on the grounds of viability. And the inspector has dealt with a whole load of stuff in the local plan, but then asked for some supplementary information and a further hearing which is going to take place on the 18th of July. Now, I think it's an interesting point, this about viability, because we accept that over the whole site, especially given what has happened in terms of industrial values going up and residential values going down, at the moment, looking at the whole site, yes, indeed, I think there is a question about viability in terms of it being able to wash its own face. But I take the view that this is a long-term project. We've always said this was a long-term project. We don't know in 10 years where values are going to be. We don't know what's going to happen to strategic industrial land. There are those who think it's reached a ceiling. Residential will almost certainly come back when some of the political uncertainties are resolved. So I personally believe we should take a very robust view at the examination in public and say that we're in this for the long haul. Our local plan is aspirational. The fact that we can't immediately dot every I, cross every T, is not a reason not to accept the local plan. But that will be up to the inspector. And inspectors take different views. Different inspectors tend to take different views. So that is definitely a challenge. Now, that is somewhat also undermined by the current political uncertainty around HS2, which regrettably we can do nothing about. I mean, obviously, political folk, the more you can talk about it and talk about the need for it, we'd be very, very grateful. And indeed, Sir Patrick McLaughlin this morning made very strong comments to the Tory leadership candidates about backing HS2. But that does put a degree of uncertainty, because as I started to explain at the beginning, we will need some underwriting in year to get cracking in advance of the HIF money actually coming into the bank. And the Mayor is, not surprisingly, cautious about committing additional funding to something where there is an element of political uncertainty over which we have absolutely no control. So that does present us with quite an interesting conundrum. Now, all I can say at the moment is we are working strenuously through these issues. And David, who's very, very kindly agreed to sort of do 2 jobs, come on board and help OPDC. He and I are having continuous ongoing discussions with the GLA and indeed with our funders, with MHCLG and Homes England. But we don't have a resolution of these challenges at the moment.
Okay. There's a number of things in what you've just said which I'd like to pick up. The HS2 element I'll leave for a colleague a bit later on because that really is one of the elephants in the room. But you talked about the need for the GLA to underwrite some of the work that you're going to need to do to satisfy the conditions that would unlock the HIF money. How much money are we talking about?
One thing it's worth just saying as a sort of prelude to my answer is that there are inevitably going to be some areas of discussion where we might have to be a little bit cautious about what we can reveal in public session, and I hope members will understand.
All I'm asking about here, David, is the amount of money that the GLA would need to provide to enable you to do your work to satisfy the conditions that would unlock the HIF bid. Yeah.
Well, the short answer to that is that the GLA is going to have to underwrite the risk associated with the 250 million of HIF, because that's part of the conditions of the housing infrastructure funding, is that the accountable body is responsible for that money. So the most obvious part of the answer is that 250 million in the event that that money is not allocated to deliver according to the milestones or the outputs in the contract. Once we have a contract signed with MHCLG, the GLA is accountable for that. In addition to that, though, as Liz has explained, there is likely to be a need for cash flow support. Now, the GLA has already agreed to some cash flow support as part of our HIF submission, and that's understood by government. What we're doing at the moment is a lot of work internally to analyse whether the amount of cash flow support is going to need to be adjusted. And at this point in time, it's not possible for me to say what that figure is going to be because we haven't concluded those deliberations. You know, as Liz says, this is a very complicated project. There are certain things that have shifted around since the HIF submission was made, and indeed some things that have shifted around since the in-principle award was made by government in March. HS2 is clearly one of those, but other things are in play as well, not least the position that we have with car giants. So we're now having to reassess some of the assumptions we made and look at what the likely cash flow requirements are going to be over the next period, particularly through to 2024, which is the drawdown deadline for HIF, but also potentially beyond that, because we're talking about a project that's probably got a 25 or 30 year lifespan. So it's very, it's actually not going to be possible for me at this moment to put a precise figure on what that level of support ultimately is going to be.
Okay. Now, you talked about the examination in public for the development plan, and Car Giant are challenging the viability of it. When are we expecting a result from the planning inspector on that?
I understand that after this further hearing in July, he has to go away and write his report, and we're not going to get that until late autumn, end of year. That sound about right? I mean, it's quite a slow process, unfortunately.
Sorry, absolutely. I mean, we're obviously in the hands of the inspector, but I would imagine that we would hear by the end of the calendar year, and we're certainly anticipating that we will have an adopted plan in the early part of 2020.
So you're expecting the inspector to approve the plan?
No. Well, when you say expecting him, we hope we will be able to convince him and that he will indeed approve the plan. Okay. There is a possibility that he may take a different view.
If he does take a different view, would that be terminal to the OPDC?
It wouldn't be terminal,
project?
but it would impose delay, and we would have to go back and discuss with MHCLG the whole issue of the HIF funding. Okay. I mean, this business of being given a chunk of money to spend within a particular window, you know, is difficult for a big project like this. There's inevitably challenges and problems come up. So we'd have to open some constructive discussions.
Okay. So since the HIF funding was confirmed, have you agreed conditions with Homes England and MHCLG?
They have set a list of conditions. That's their right. We are working through them. Some are easier to deal with than others. But I think, as I said in my introductory remarks, one of the key ones is the examination in public. If we the local plan, and if that is going to be a problem, that actually slightly dwarfs all the rest.
Yeah. Okay. Which is understood, I think. So, I mean, what happens? 2024 is when you have to spend the HIF money, or what you have to draw it down by then. If you don't succeed in drawing all of it down by then, what happens? Does it get returned to MHCLG?
Well, in theory, in the terms in which it is offered, yes, but I always tend to believe there's scope for negotiation in these situations. I mean, this is going to be a big national piece of infrastructure. In the HS2 station, it's going to be a big piece of national infrastructure, and what happens around it is going to be nationally important. And I think it would be very difficult for government to pull the plug on something like that. But you can't get government to agree that today. You have to play that as it goes.
Now, in terms of the additional staff that you identified as necessary in your budget, have you managed to recruit them all? I mean, you have 2 interims flanking you today.
I do, yes, and very grateful I am, actually. We are in discussion at the moment with how we try and cement our staff complement. I'll ask David to say a little bit about what he's done since he actually arrived at OPDC. To be honest, our recruitment is challenging because until we can get this degree of certainty around where the project is going, and indeed our HIF funding, then finding the right person certainly to come in and lead the organisation is difficult. But David, could you say a little bit about what you've done with the staffing structure and what we're planning to do for the rest of the year?
Yeah. So the senior team at the moment includes one new recruit, which is a director of land and property, and that's somebody who previously worked for OPDC before taking a job actually with TfL. And they've now returned, and they've been in post for 3 or 4 weeks. So we've got someone in a very senior position there who already has plenty of experience of the project. So that's a very welcome addition. We've also got a new, or relatively new, director of development who's returned from an extended paternity leave, who was formerly employed by Hammerson's, so has a strong commercial background. So I've got 2 permanent directors to strengthen the team, neither of whom were in post with us a few weeks ago. In addition to that, I've got a couple of highly experienced and accomplished short-term consultants supporting programme and infrastructure on the one hand and supporting me as Chief Operating Officer on the other. And my intention, for the short term at least, is to consolidate the leadership team around that group because, as Liz has explained, there's a tremendous amount that we need to resolve and settle quite quickly. And I think, and the board I think agrees with me, that rather than be distracted with lengthy and potentially quite risky recruitment challenges at a time when many of those issues are still to be settled, we really need to get that team focused and working on settling the issues, which we hope will create a more stable environment, which will be a much easier position to be in if we're looking to recruit high calibre, very senior staff. Okay. So I'm pretty confident at the moment that we've got the right team because they're very committed and they have experience of the project. Looking forward, we may well need 1 or 2 more senior recruits once those issues I've mentioned get settled.
And I think it's also fair to say, assuming we can get into genuine delivery phase, then you're starting to look at beefing up the team with people with very specific sort of large project construction experience. So perhaps a delivery director of some sort. But we're not at that stage yet. We're still at the planning stage.
Okay, so we've got recruitment, whether or not the GLA will underwrite the HIF loan or the HIF grant and the HIF drawdown itself are all subject to a fair degree of uncertainty at this point in time. What's going to be the catalyst that unlocks all of that? Is it literally the planning inspector's report, which we expect by the end of the year?
Oh, I think that will be a huge tick in terms of moving forward with satisfying our conditions. So that will indeed be helpful. I think the discussions with the GLA and with our funders and potentially other funders are going to be, those discussions are going to be absolutely key to ensuring that we can actually start delivery of the first phase, what we call phase 1A, which is effectively what the HIF bid was all about funding.
Okay. Now, returning just briefly before we leave this subject to the issue of recruitment, particularly David is covering the he's the interim CEO, which I gather you're doing part-time. Did you, I mean, Victoria Hills, I think, left around about a year ago. Am I correct in that?
Yes, we appointed then one of the senior team to be an interim in her place. We started a recruitment exercise, but at that stage our HIF bid was still sort of in the pipeline, and it was very difficult to get the right sort of person focused on delivery when you couldn't actually say that we'd got the resources to do any delivery. So we went so far with the recruitment exercise, but with the agreement of the Mayor's people and Jules Pipe, we decided to suspend it, since Mick also seemed to be coping very well as the interim. Sadly, Mick was lured back to Ireland, nothing to do with Brexit, I hasten to add, but he decided he wanted to return to his native island, which also left us then with a problem, because we still at that point hadn't got HIF resolution. And even though we've sort of got a partial HIF resolution, we haven't nailed it completely for all the reasons I explained, because of this extraordinarily long-winded process of Housing Infrastructure Fund allocations. So I was able to persuade David to come in as interim. You'll have to ask David how many hours he thinks he spends on the job. Quite a lot, I suspect. And for the moment, from my perspective, that's working well. David might have a nervous breakdown, but he'll talk to you. He'll talk to you about that. And I think it's difficult for us to get somebody else in the meantime. I think we've got to resolve some of these bigger issues. So I'm sort of gently leaning on David to spend more time on OPDC, which given his other responsibilities, well, he is devoting a lot of time to us, and I don't feel we're missing out at the moment on chief executive leadership. Okay.
Now, looking at because you've now got a capital budget, a large part of which would be the HIF bid. Some of it is donations, some of it has yet to be realised, and that's focused on land acquisition, land assembly, and infrastructure, isn't it?
Yeah.
My understanding is that you're hoping to install some of the infrastructure with a view to generating further funding to acquire more land. Is that a fair way of putting it?
I think the HIF bid, the way we've positioned it, and I think we are allowed to talk about this, and by the way, any sort of coyness on revealing details of the HIF bid is very much because we have to take our lead from MHCLG, who have been quite clear that this is a commercially sensitive document. And are very concerned that we hold that line. Otherwise it puts them in a very difficult position. But I think it's fair to say that the HIF bid would broadly be spent half and half on land acquisition and on infrastructure. The land acquisition, once you then put so you go out, you buy the land, you then put the infrastructure in, which improves the value potential of that land. And depending on how we actually do the development, we reap reward through the onward sale of the oven-ready sites for development of varying sorts. So that's how you make up a large chunk of money to actually bridge the gap between the basic HIF money and what we need to spend in the long run. That's the plot. And of course, land values in London are hugely difficult to predict at the moment. You can ask one set of surveyors for a set of numbers and then probably get a different one from another set 3 weeks later. So again, that is subject to a degree of uncertainty, and we won't be selling this stuff for quite a few years yet. So an awful lot can happen in a few years.
Right, so what I gave you was a fairly rough and ready summary, but a reasonably accurate one. Okay, you said it far more eloquently than I did, but you know more about it than I do, so that's fair enough. But the importance of infrastructure then is key, and so I've done that as a segue really, because the next section we're going to talk about is infrastructure, and Assembly Member Pigeon is leading on that.
Could I just pick up one question just from the earlier discussion. I understand you can't give us an exact figure, but David, you're in discussion with the GLA for this money to underwrite. And also you said you've got to underwrite the 250 million, but you also need money with cash flow. Are we talking tens of millions? Are we talking hundreds of millions? Are you able to give us a flavour? And particularly, can the GLA afford this, given the GLA is stretched with the additional borrowing that it's funding for Crossrail?
Yeah, well, obviously the HIF submission that went in towards the end of last year only went in because the GLA was persuaded that it was a fundable and deliverable proposition from the GLA's perspective. So I think that certainly at that point, the cash flow requirements were regarded as manageable. Now, as I've explained, it is a very complicated project. It's quite unusual, actually, to have a project of this scale that's led by the public sector, where at this stage, the public sector actually has no position with regard to land. I mean, the OPDC owns no land in its area. And that really provides, that puts us in a slightly weak position, which is why so much of the HIF is allocated to land acquisition to deliver the uplift that Liz has talked about. But the questions around cash flow are so complicated to unravel in the context of what shifted quite dramatically in the last year or two around industrial land values and residential land values, around build cost inflation. There are some big questions that we're still working through about the correct procurement strategy and the balance that needs to be struck ultimately between doing deals to buy land, or potentially maybe doing fewer deals to buy land and maybe a little bit more money in infrastructure. And certainly we're talking to some of the major landowners like Network Rail about the options there. So I'm not going to sit here and say that there aren't some major cash flow challenges, because there very well could be. And certainly the GLA finance team are putting those challenges back to me and back to Liz. But that then raises some really big questions, as I've described, for us around, do we need to think again about the procurement strategy for this? Do we need to think about possibly a different relationship with the landowners? We need to take account of all of the things that are moving around and some of the things that have changed since the original HIF submission was put together. So that's probably not an entirely satisfactory answer, because I can't honestly give you a figure. But obviously, if we're talking about potentially increasing the risk to the GLA into a figure of, for instance, many hundreds of millions of pounds, then we're probably in a space where we can't go, given the exposure to LLDC, Crossrail and other things. So the challenge that I have, and the challenge that Liz and the board have, is to find a route through this which can get us broadly back to some of the financial assumptions, at least, or the risk assumptions that were included at the time that the HIF submission was made.
You coming into this role, and to be honest, the first I heard you were doing it was when I got my briefing sheet telling me you were interim, so there's obviously a comms issue there. But you're in this role, so you're bringing to it just a complete challenge of kind of all the assumptions and how you can get this to stack up. Is that right?
Yeah, I think the sort of challenge that Liz gave me was, look, if you're willing to come in and give some interim support to the organisation, if you like, the performance incentive is that if you can get the HIF conditions sorted out and landed, then you can escape back to your day job. So I see my role very much as trying to get a handle on those issues and get to a point where, the GLA can be satisfied that the risk is bankable and that MHCLG is content to release the funding, and then we can get the whole thing moving. So that's really what I've been focused on for the last 3 months now.
I think it's also worth saying, interesting sort of issue around the timing of all this, because having on the team, worked their socks off to get this HIF bid in September, then we had a very odd sort of 6-month period while we were sitting on our hands is wrong. People were doing lots, but there was a lot of sort of pause, badgering MHCLG, badgering Homes England, when is the answer going to come? Now, Mick left just before we got the answer. And so actually by the time I managed to persuade David to come in and help us out, you know, then we had to almost sort of not start again, but had to re-evaluate all the assumptions we'd made at the point at which we put the HIF bid in, because 6 months had lapsed. You know, we knew at that point then we were going to get the, I won't say go ahead, but the half go ahead. So then we had to start and sort of re-look at everything we'd assumed back in September. And unfortunately, you know, a lot changes in 6 months.
Okay, so let's think about the infrastructure. I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer this, but what is the expected total cost of the required supporting infrastructure over the life of the development?
Well, the number that we have, we sort of trot out in somewhat sort of high-level strategic presentations for the whole thing over a period of 25 years is probably about £1 billion.
Right.
That's the number I tend to use as a sort of proof of just how large and complex this particular site is.
And how much of this is going to be delivered directly by OPDC, or is that still?
Well, again, I mean, in a 25-year project, there are lots of different ways of doing different phases of it. I mean, I've always said, and I'm sure I've said to this committee before, that you know, this is far too bigger thing to swallow in one go. You have to look at this in a number of phases. We don't really know the shape of some of the future phases because they'll be totally dependent on the delivery of the station and the release of some of the HS2 work sites around the station. They in themselves in 10, 15 years' time will have a very different value to what they have now. The HS2 station being there will also have an impact on land value. So you may be looking at a considerably larger yield on things like SIL, which will help you fund the infrastructure. And that's sort of way downstream. You know, our immediate problem is how we can stretch our 250 million to do the infrastructure necessary to unlock this phase 1A, which I've always sort of quaintly called the Northern Arc, but always ends up with about 5 different names. But it's this swathe of development around the northern part of the site, which I've always believed if we can get that done, and that in itself, you know, will take up to 24, 25, then you're looking at a significant enhancement in value of the rest of the site. Because also by then, again, fingers crossed, HS2 will be well out of the ground. You know, the station will be a recognisable entity, you know, and that in itself will also have an impact on values. So, you know, this has got to be a long-term play, and it's just about how you get that first bit started when the values are still very, very challenging.
So it's incredibly complex. I can picture what you mean by your arch from the map you've got, and it's almost if you think where if you didn't have the Olympics unlocking the site that LLDC had without something like that to drive it.
And I mean, if you look at the injection of funds that went into the Olympics to get the basic infrastructure in place, it'd be great. We'll have a fraction of that, thank you very much.
Yeah, but it's without something like that, it's incredibly challenging. So you've mentioned the elephant in the room, High Speed 2. You're going to have this amazing station there. We hope. So have you been involved in the design of this station? Does it support your development plans? And how critical is this station to your plans of development?
Let me just put that in very broad context, and then I'll let David talk about the design, because the team have been very closely involved with, on an ongoing basis, are still involved with HS2. I mean, the whole premise of OPDC as a mayoral development corporation is based around the interchange between HS2 and Crossrail. Now, if for any reason HS2 was cancelled, and as I say, this is rather above my pay grade, you know, the decisions are going to be taken about HS2, and then the GLA, TfL, would presumably take a view on whether they wanted a Crossrail station there. I don't know what the answer to that is. Personally, I think it'd be a great idea, but, you know, that's going to be something TfL will have to think about. And if you get neither of those, then the rationale for OPDC does somewhat change. Now, it's still a great swathe of potentially valuable land in West London, but if you're not going to have a station at the southern part of it, then you might look quite differently at the phasing of any development of that area. I mean, you might switch your attention to how could you create a brilliant transport hub over and around Willesden Junction, for example. Well, it's already got the transport infrastructure, it's just got a rather limited station. But you could do a huge amount there. Councillor Butt of Brent is extremely keen on seeing development in that end of the site and sort of joining Harlesden up better with Willesden Junction. But, you know, these are all speculative discussions. They're all totally dependent on our politicians nailing HS2.
No, absolutely. And I fully understand how crucial High Speed 2 is. But if there isn't a High Speed 2, if that gets pulled, then you're going to have to rework. I think there is some serious rethinking to be done. And I mean, obviously, again, also above and beyond my pay grade, because that is something the mayor and the deputy mayors involved in this will want to take a view of. Do you want to talk a bit about the station design and the work we've done with HS2?
Yeah, I mean, we've got a very good relationship with HS2. We meet them very regularly. The last meeting was the week before last, and you know, we had quite a long discussion about things like public realm and linkages, because one of the big challenges around HS2 is, you know, actually getting over the railway infrastructure that's there. It's one of the other massive kind of challenges of OPDC's area. It's difficult to think of anywhere in the country actually that's got more railway infrastructure that's going to have to be left in situ but worked around. HS2 is very committed, I'm pleased to say, to a positive strategy around things like public realm, retail, and, you know, creating a kind of sense of a bit of a sense of a sort of town centre around a station, which ultimately will be larger than Waterloo. So this is going to be, you know, a very considerable investment. And it's worth saying as well that, you know, when Liz mentions, you know, the £1 billion of infrastructure that may eventually be necessary to unlock the entirety of the site, that excludes the HS2 infrastructure investment, which is obviously very, very considerable.
Which is about £1 billion, I think the station's costing.
Yeah, something like that. So, you know, that needs to be sort of factored in, really. And that inevitably is going to create quite a lot of development value that hopefully we can help utilise to recover some of our costs. I think though, as well as the kind of big headline question, which none of us have got an answer to at the moment, which is, you know, is HS2 going to proceed at all, or is there a risk of cancellation? The other issues that are obviously in play is that there's a great deal of work going on within the HS2 team to look at various options for value engineering to keep within their £56 billion budget. And that's one of the reasons why we've been very keen to remain very engaged to ensure that that value engineering doesn't impact negatively on our plans and proposals for Old Oak. I think the other thing that's obviously, you know, worth mentioning is that, you know, at the moment the notice to proceed, the formal parliamentary government notice to proceed, until that's triggered, the main contract for works on HS2 can't be let or activated. That's now been postponed to December this year, and that does start to raise some concerns, I think. Certainly if there's an additional extension beyond that, as to, at some point, questioning whether the station can actually open within the time frame that we currently know. We've obviously got a keen interest on that, because never mind the value engineering or the big meta question of cancellation, but our plans at the moment are very contingent on the idea of a station opening in 2026. You know, if that were to move, that would inevitably impact on our programme, because we need the station to open to generate the accessibility and the value in the land.
Okay, thank you for that. You talked about over the project £1 billion approximately is needed in infrastructure. Is all of it essential? Is there kind of, this is the minimum we need and these are the nice to have, the add-ons? Or is it all pretty much essential?
I think that £1 billion, and you know, there's a bit of a sort of wet finger in the air on that. I think that's pretty essential. I don't think we're doing much sort of this is nice to have, because when you look at that site, I mean, you can't get in and out of it at the moment, you know, other than over a couple of rather ghastly little sort of footbridges that you wouldn't dare walk over after dark. The whole thing is locked in by railways, so you have to build bridges and tunnels in order to get into the site. We have to have power generation.
Yes.
We've got some very exciting plans, you know, to go for sort of green energy. We'd like to work with the Canals and Rivers Trust to use the Grand Union Canal, but you still need to pay for the basic infrastructure. We have got to acquire the land. You have to do that. That's not or we have to work in some way that the land can be brought in. But as David said, if we do a partnership agreement, for example, with Network Rail and don't acquire the land, then we don't benefit fully from the uplift we'd get if we did acquire the land and would then be able to take 100% of the uplift ourselves. So that affects your overall equation for the site. So I think, our billion is not over-egging it.
Okay.
I'd just add as well that our assumption behind those sort of headline numbers are that as well as paying, if you like, for the kind of hard infrastructure to get roads and utilities, we've also got some very ambitious plans around sustainable utility management, because we're very keen to see that the area, really exemplifies some of the things in the new draft London plan around water management, around sustainable energy, and so forth. So that's included in those numbers. And in addition to that, there's a whole social infrastructure piece, new primary schools, ultimately new secondary school, a lot of community facilities. So it's not just roads and sort of electricity, it's also very much with an aim to community development as well.
Still don't, in terms of that wider infrastructure, you still don't have, for example, nurseries and childcare provision in there.
No, that's in there.
That would be included in
When I've asked before, it's not in there. You have schools, you haven't thought about, and actually if you want family-friendly housing, and if you want to, it's got to be right through from...
I mean, there are ways and ways of ensuring that comes in a development. That's I mean, if you've got a particular development plot, then as part of your planning for that, seeking allocation of a part of it for a nursery, which could be privately run, which could be funded through Section 106, through SIL. There's different ways of doing it. We haven't got to that level of granularity. But I agree with you. You've got to have that sort of thing. I mean, we are trying to build a community there. Exactly. We're not trying to build a residential suburb where everybody lives. Yeah. It's not just about residential. It's about jobs, and therefore you need everything that creates a new, well, I view it as a new district of London. And that's the ultimate prize. So you're absolutely right. We have to make sure we fund everything that is essential, or we have a system which allows for that to be funded.
And then my other question really is around other stations. 2 additional overground stations seem to me they're quite critical for your development. TfL has said doesn't have the money to pay for Hythe Road and Old Oak Common stations. How are your discussions with that? Are you looking that you would have to put the money in at some point? Is this one of your huge risks? My understanding, and that slightly takes me by surprise, because I certainly thought Hythe Road was absolutely off the agenda. I mean, given that TfL have said that they are not going to build it, there is an issue about whether you would still turn the embankment on which the overground runs into a viaduct, because that would massively improve the way in which you could develop the land under it. But that's very much phase 1B, because of course that's actually slap bang in the middle of the car giant land, and that is where we've got some slight problems with the land ownership. I'm afraid I don't know about Old Oak. The Hythe Road you're saying is off the table.
Hythe Road, as far as I can see, is off the table, unless at some point in the future, if and when that larger phase of the site gets developed, whoever is developing, you can do it as part of the SIL or part of a deal. But certainly TfL have made it quite clear that they're not paying for it, because they have done the modelling and they don't believe that there is actually the demand. Yeah, because
they consulted on the 2 new overground stations.
Well, it was yes, and I thought the point at which they'd consulted, but I'm sorry, this is sort of slightly outside of my immediate expertise, but I can remember the discussion we had with them, and I sort of said, well, why are you consulting when you've already, as far as I can see, you don't have the proof in your modelling that you're going to actually be able to support it. So that was the Hythe Road one.
Old Oak Common Station, there's no money.
Well, I thought that was still sort of a possibility, but it by no means certain.
There's lots of things in TfL's plans. They just have absolutely no cash for
money.
them.
No.
So how are you looking at, if you want that as part of your connectivity for your site to improve it and to increase land values, will you look to put money in? Are you looking?
My understanding is that we don't view that one as essential for our development. I think that's it would be a nice to have, but it's not essential.
Right. So those 2 may never happen.
Yeah.
Then you're not.
I mean, at the moment, on the way things are looking, I would have thought the probability of them happening is very slight.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Okay, I saw Assembly Member Berry.
Yes, I just wanted to ask, I know earlier on you said that you weren't able to release, sorry, this is Liz, you weren't able to release the HIF bid documents because HCLG were asking you not to, effectively. Obviously, in terms of infrastructure, we're very interested in the transport infrastructure part of that. Is it possible to get the transport appraisal part of that released? Because that would be very informative on its own without the HIF, because this is transport. None of this is private as such.
In terms of sort of the numbers who require you, how you justify wanting an underpass and overpass.
Yeah, essentially the cost benefit analysis, the appraisal of the transport, the analysis there. There have been issues with other bids in other parts of the country where, for example, cycling was pulled out because it doesn't do very well in DFT analysis,
no.
And therefore
in your BCR and the way that
yes, all of that, yeah.
things, absolutely.
So in terms of that, it'd be really useful to be able to see those parts of the documents. I don't know if you have a view on whether or not you are able to release those, or whether or not DFT might control those. They're usually quite good at releasing appraisals.
No, DFT would not. I mean, those are our plans submitted to MHCLG because they are the basis of our HIF bid. I don't know. I'd have to take that one away. I mean, I don't see any reason why we couldn't show what infrastructure we need to have around that northern arc. I mean, It's quite clear in my mind, and I've talked about it at conferences. We have to have a bridge over the canal. I then lose track of whether it's a bridge or an underpass. We then need another bridge, underpass, bridge, in order to actually get round the north of the site.
But the transport appraisal,
we need the cycling and yes.
Yeah, the costs and benefits of that are not. I mean, presumably the commercial parts of it are to do with the land assembly, the potential prices you wish to pay for land. That's the commercial side of things. Whereas transport appraisal is usually fairly openly done.
Yes, and the infrastructure is what the infrastructure is. That's what you need to get into the site. So, and there are numbers attached to that, and the way the appraisal for the HIF bid was done, obviously looks at how you use the money that's granted to us, how you can then supplement it by the land selling the land you bought at some later phase in order to pay for the rest of the infrastructure. But the infrastructure need, I mean, when you say a sort of an appraisal on each piece of infrastructure, I don't think it quite works in that way, because the site doesn't work unless you actually have this infrastructure. David, can you help me out on this one?
I'll try. I think probably the most important place to look actually is the draft local plan and the transport appraisal work that was done as part of that, because that is publicly available and that will obviously set the planning framework for everything we do.
Yeah. No, I'm not asking you to tell me what transport is planned. I'm specifically looking for the transport bid as part of the HIF, and I think that can be treated separately to the housing and land part of it. I don't expect you to.
I don't think there was a separate transport bid as such. The bid document obviously has a section within it that deals with transport impacts and approach to dealing with transport. But I mean, to be honest, it's fairly thin, because what it sits on in terms of policy is what's contained in the draft London Plan policy around cycling and sustainable transport. So, I mean, I'm happy to look at whether we can release that bit, but I think you may be slightly disappointed if you thought it was a sort of huge, great piece of work.
I would assume it would use standard DFT methodology, which would make it quite hefty. Somewhere, maybe it's a supporting document, but that's really what I'm interested in seeing.
Okay. I'll look at that.
Thank you.
And get back to you.
Okay, we've talked a lot about the infrastructure. We haven't talked about how the infrastructure is being funded, so Sandhu and Deval's leading on that.
Can I begin by congratulating you on the Housing Investment Fund? It's better to have those challenges, albeit I recognise they are difficult.
Do you know what I mean?
But I mean, to be successful and to be recognised in that way, fine. And along comes with that the opportunity. Now, on the funding issue, I wonder if you can help the committee. I'm interested in the 4-year first phase. I think you may call it, we call it Merrill budgeting phase, but it goes beyond, it's from now leading up to that period 2022/23. So there are various gaps here. Maybe you can help us about how we're going to bridge those. So if I set the scene, and then I've got some questions. So let's see if our figures check with your figures in terms of assumptions. So there's a bit of uncertainty in this first phase of funding. You've got, you don't appear to have enough funding to cover the 4-year mayoral budgeting period. The 549 million investment in this 4-year budget period is only partly funded. That apparently you found 313 million of the funding, leaving a gap of 237 million. Now, of course, in terms of these gaps, I probably ought not to worry. They're always there on some of these projects. As you said, Liz, this is a 25-year project, and certainly things can shift within that 4-year period. But can you then tell us, and you've covered it in part, but if we can concentrate, well, let's go between the extent of the gap between OPDC's ambitions and anticipated funding. And so how, you know, along with how the funding is being managed, can you just explain that to those figures? Is something you recognise, or have we slightly got them wrong in our background?
I'm not sure I entirely understand the figures then. I mean, I've got some figures of my own, but they
well, why don't you try your
completely
figures
correlate.
and we'll try and work
I think
it through.
I think if I understand the question, if the question is, you know, there's obviously a larger capital sum required than we've got cover for over the next 4-year period. Is that broadly it?
Broadly.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's probably true at the moment.
So just before you go into explanation, so what do you think your figures are then? What figures are you working to?
Well,
in that 4-year period?
Well, I'm reluctant to be drawn on the numbers.
Why?
Because if I quote a number, then it's likely to be quoted back to me, and it may be quoted back to me by those that we are currently being challenged by. And I am slightly anxious, therefore, to be, you know, pretty cautious about sharing numbers. Not least as well because any numbers at this stage are going to be very speculative for all the reasons that we've described, you know. But if the point is that there is a substantial gap, then I agree that there is a substantial gap which needs to be filled. Now, the assumption in the HIF bid and the assumption that we've used to date is that those gaps in cash flow are going to be covered through deals on the land that we acquire. So a combination of SIL receipts, because obviously we're the planning authority, the charging authority, and the value increase as a consequence of this investment in land, infrastructure, remediation, and so forth, should be sufficient to cover those gaps. But the question, of course, that sits behind that is, well, what's the risk around that? And clearly there is a risk, which is why we are talking to the GLA and why we are looking again at whether we've got the right approach to the relationship with key landowners and the right approach to procurement of a development or delivery partner. And at this stage, I'm not trying to evade the question, but those questions are still very active and have not yet been resolved. But in a way, I sort of liken it in a way to another project that's got a big cash flow problem, which, you know, in my other job I'm very involved in, which is the Royal Docks. So the Royal Docks, as we know, is London's only enterprise zone. The Mayor and the GLA have signed off on a delivery programme which is somewhere north of £300 million. They've done that because the Mayor was convinced that although there is risk around it, the income from the enterprise zone uplift in business rates is sufficient over time to repay that investment. And without that investment, you don't get the increase in business rate. So that risk was assumed to be, or has been judged to be, a sensible one because it not only regenerates the Royal Docks, but it actually generates the income we need to repay the debt to the GLA. And I think in some ways OPDC is similar. Now, obviously, it's not an enterprise zone. There's no retention of business rate, certainly not at the moment, although that might be an interesting question for the future in terms of looking to bring in additional revenues. So the assumption we've made thus far is that our upfront investment, which is very welcome, the 250 million, we don't need to repay that. The gap is not going to be business rate income in this case, it's going to be development deals and land receipts.
And of course, in terms of that 250 million of the Housing Investment Fund money, will go to purchasing some of that land. Will go to purchasing land. do we, I suppose, at this stage, have an idea of how much of that land that we're going to be purchasing?
Yes, we do. We know that we're looking at a number of key sites in, as we've described it, the Phase 1A, the Northern Arc, as Liz has described it. So that includes some of the major network rail sites. So one of those is a large site currently occupied by a metal reprocessing plant. We think that's got capacity for around about 1,500 homes. We're also aware that there's a whole string of other smaller land interests. There's land that's currently in the ownership of Hammersmith and Fulham. All of this land at the moment is designated for industrial use. So our assumption has been that we can acquire that land effectively at existing use value plus a modest premium, and that the development value associated with high quality residential development with all this new infrastructure will give us a substantial uplift. So that's the assumption we've made, and that assumption we hope will be sufficient to address the cash flow needs and satisfy the GLA that it's a risk worth undertaking.
Would I not be right thinking, and you mentioned the challenges that you face, and presumably they may end up, well, they will end up legal challenges. Will you have to show some of those assumptions of what the proceeds of the disposals will bring in at that stage? Is that your reticence about coming forward and telling us the exact amounts that you're working on in bridging the gap?
Well, as I say, I think part of the issue at the moment is that, to be perfectly honest, I've not got a firm set of figures even for internal purposes at the moment. You know, we are still analysing, for instance, the property cost estimate, which is, you know, the benchmark that we're using for analysing the likely land acquisition costs. I think we're fairly close to that now, but, you know, the figures are moving around depending on, you know, what we assume to be movements in industrial land prices over the next period, and ditto on infrastructure costs, because, you know, the committee may be aware that, you know, in terms of actually satisfying or settling the final alignment of, for instance, the East-West Road, one of the judgments that we need to make is, can we ensure that we have an alignment that delivers our development objectives and our commercial objectives, whilst at the same time minimising the impact on existing businesses, and particularly minimising the impact on those businesses that may be in a position to challenge what it is we want to do, either at the planning inquiry, the EIP, or at a subsequent CPO inquiry. So until we've actually resolved that, and where is this road going to go, and where are the utilities going to go, it's quite difficult to actually get a firm figure on the infrastructure costs. What I can say is, as we've all acknowledged, that there is going to remain a cash flow challenge, but I'm really reluctant to sort of put numbers to that at the moment.
And is it? Let's go back in terms. I suppose we're looking for reassurances that you've got plans A's, plan B's, and plan C's, and that somehow they're all going to add up and come together, and that the gap doesn't stop what is going to be probably a new, is a new quarter where people will work, live and play, to be honest. And so let's go, so in that 4-year period that I've mentioned, it's probably too early to start saying when you expect to start receiving disposal proceeds, wasn't it? Where would it be if all things were normal and going swimmingly well? That's the right phrase, I don't know. When would you expect to see some proceeds coming back into the organisation? And, along with that, give us paint some pictures for us about how do you manage those cash flow issues when you require some of that infrastructure that needs to be paid for? I think what we want to know is about, in terms of there is infrastructure you can't not do,
exactly.
That have to happen. And if you miss out on that, or the money's not there to do it, that's going to be at the detriment to the regeneration of this area, isn't it? And it could have significant time issues of either saying, yeah, we're going to do this in 25 years, or it becomes 35 years or longer. You know, so where, paint some pictures for us around that, or is that too difficult?
I think it's probably fair to say that there are one or two early wins that if we can get our plan through its examination in public, that we could proceed with. So, for example, we are already on site at something called Oakland South, which is a site on Old Oak Lane. In fact, this is a Network Rail site where Genesis Notting Hill Genesis are doing a development. Now, there is a further tranche of Network Rail land, which, if we could nail the agreement with Network Rail fairly quickly, we could get a planning we could acquire the site and we could get a planning permission sorted. You know, that could proceed quite quickly, and that would be an early win. And it also makes a lot of sense because it's largely an extension of Oakland South. We call it Oakland's North. Now, there are a few complications in that you need a bridge from that site over the canal to the north of the canal. But there's no reason you couldn't start the development before you've actually started the bridge, because actually it's got perfectly good access onto Old Oak Lane. And as long as you retain the area you need for the bridge to land, the added complication, and one of the reasons it's taken a while for us to get to grips with Network Rail on this, is because they also need to retain a small part of the site for their lorries to come in and actually access the railway line. I can't remember which railway line it is. There is a railway line close by which they need to access. But that is the sort of example where you could get cracking fairly quickly. You know, once we've nailed the EIP, and that is indeed in the sequencing of expenditure and income that we have shared, you know, our very, very draft speculative one that we've shared with MHCLG and Homes England. Okay,
we've got some questions coming on that later on around that bit. So given these gaps then in that, and David, you mentioned that the possibility of, well, look, there's one way of funding it. Should it be another enterprise zone? Do they exist? Do they not exist? Now under this new regime or under the future regime, I don't know which. You know, is that a way forward? Where are we on borrowing? See, I'm keen to pursue what accelerates issues. Now, I think there are some key decisions that you've outlined earlier on, and rather than, you know, where do we? I mean, this scheme has got to survive a few downturns, isn't it? Yep. As you know, maybe one very soon, depending on what the states of Brexit or the international markets are. It could be a combination of two. So the question then is, so what other issues of, maybe it's to you, Liz, have you considered that may well be, where are we on borrowing within the organisation? Has there been any discussions with the mayoral office that this could be an option to look at in terms of keeping this project on track and taking some of those key decisions, Liz, that you said? So what conversation has taken place, or is it, you know, at an early stage? And if it was possible, when does that come in on timescales?
So, I mean, as I'm sure members will be aware, I mean, that, you know, the GLA is quite heavily indebted. You know, there is a prudential borrowing code that obviously is going to put some constraints about what core GLA is able to fund. But I think there is scope, as we've already discussed, for, you know, GLA to accept some risk around this project, and indeed it would have to, because that's part of the assumptions behind the HIF submission, certainly the 250 million. I think, though, in addition, you're right, Len, I think there are some interesting options here, which is one of the reasons why I said earlier that I think we shouldn't rule out possibly a slightly different approach to procurement and development partnerships here, because, you know, if we have a sum of £250 million that we can invest in land and infrastructure, one way of allocating that and accelerating the project is to buy land and develop infrastructure ourselves as a public sector, and then sell parcels of land to get our money back and more. And that's a perfectly valid, credible way to proceed. But it's just possible that another way to proceed might be to say, well, we've got £250 million. Maybe there's an option to look at some partnership arrangements with others. You know, we've already talked about Network Rail as a major landowner. Possibly there could be, there's certainly a discussion that's worth having about at what stage you bring in a third party to help with the overall development, who might be in a position to share some of the risk around infrastructure and land preparation. And you're absolutely right that, you know, there are opportunities in both the private sector and indeed the public sector these days to look at some quite innovative forms of investment and loan finance. So the good news about the HIF is that it's not actually repayable so long as it's invested in the way that the submission sets out. But we are aware, obviously, that there are other loan funds. I mean, the GLA makes use of them. The government has quite extensive loan funding availability through Homes England and other devices. So I think there are possibly some ways to stretch this money a little bit further and start to look at de-risking some of that cash flow, which is another reason why, you know, I think we probably need another look at some of the assumptions we've made before we finally settle things, both with GLA, because I think they're going to ask us those questions, but also with government, because they're going to require an answer to how we fund that cash flow before the HIF conditions can be met.
And my last question, in terms of phasing and finding some of the key infrastructure developments, it's better to have those in this 4-year phase at least ready to go than fragmented in part or elements, isn't it? And there are some of the decisions, because you could pull back and say we're going to cut back on that and not do X or not do Y, but we do A, B and C.
It would be very difficult to do any of the, well, pretty much barring this Oaklands North development, I can't really see how we could do any of the development around that northern arc without the key pieces of infrastructure. So, I mean, if you take the EMR site, the current, well, not exactly owners, some people with a legal interest in it are really, really keen to crack on and develop it. And, you know, we've said, well, you can't get in and out of it. You can't do a development if people can't actually access it easily, and you have sensible means of, you know, both pedestrian cycling and vehicular access. So I'm sure you know the site probably as well, if not better than I do. You know, that whole area would be very, very difficult to open up for residential development without putting principally the transport infrastructure. You're on numbers at that stage where you don't trigger some of the broader social infrastructure, because we're still at a relatively small number, but it would be a great start, you know. But you've got to put those roads and bridges in.
Thank you.
Okay, so remember Pigeon.
Yeah, fascinating hearing from you this morning. I think I would not be sleeping at all if I was managing all the risks that you are, quite frankly. Looking at your corporate risk document around the issue of funding and finance, you know, it's really concerning. It's rated very severe red in your latest assessment. And basically saying that potentially you've got, as we've discussed, insufficient financing funding to do what you want to do. How are you managing that? And also one of the areas I was reading about is that OPDC has targeted a number of LEAP programmes, and we heard from the LEAP last week at Assembly to gain funding, including the Good Growth Fund to deliver early activation projects in the Scrubs Lane area, for example. We know that pot of money in some of the European funds that the LEAP manages, certainly from 2023, is going to shift to some other fund, and we're not quite sure whether London will have proper access to that. What's your contingency planning there? And this surely could have another impact on your finances to deliver in whatever number of phases your project.
You'll have to help me on assumptions we made about LEAP funding, because I wasn't aware that figured in our discussions. I mean, yes, we've been fortunate enough to get, I always forget, this is the Good Growth one, as opposed to the, what's the other money? Great Places. Yes, I always get those two muddled up. Yes, so I mean, the Good Growth funding, it's been, we're very grateful for it, but it's relatively small, and it is about, as you described them, early activation, sort of place-making improvements which could be very helpful in allowing us to sort of open up the Scrubs Lane side of development. We've already got a number of planning applications that have been granted there. I've had some interesting discussions with two of the developers sort of asking why they're not actually getting on with it. And you know, I think again some of this comes back to, well, the ambiance, the infrastructure. So if we could make it, you know, use that good growth funding to make some improvements in Scrubs Lane, then they might be a little more inspired to get on with their development. So it all helps. But I didn't think we were planning on good growth or LEAP funding in our broader, you know, the bigger picture stuff.
No, I mean, yeah, I mean, Liz is completely right. I mean, it's great that we've got Great Places money. It's great that we've got good growth money. And I think, you know, these relatively small amounts of money are really important in terms of catalysing, you know, community confidence and some early wins, because we don't need, you know, vast new road infrastructures and utilities to do these things. And anyone who, you know, takes an hour or two to wander around the area will realise that, you know, there's some fantastic opportunities here with, you know, canal front and, you know, some great spaces like the Scrubs itself, which are really underused and in very poor condition. So this is really about trying to create some local confidence and some local amenity, which we think is really important. You know, we spent a lot of time this morning talking about big developments and big infrastructure. This is just as importantly a project which is about, you know, community benefit and local confidence in our plans. And that's where this money can trigger some benefit. I think that although these sources of funding are at risk, and you're quite right, Caroline, that, you know, that's why it's red risk rated, you know, I think we ought to be reasonably confident that funds like this will continue to exist, that the support that we're currently enjoying from the 3 boroughs at leader level, and the support that we are getting, and we are doing a lot more work to encourage that support from organisations like the Canals and River Trust, the Grand Union Alliance and other local interests, ought to put us in a strong position for competing for these funds in the future, particularly as some of the more strategic changes hopefully start to reveal themselves. Because, you know, if and when we do end up with a firm commitment to a new railway station and interchange larger than Waterloo, this is going to be an absolutely fundamental change to West London. The sort of thing that we haven't seen in this city for, well, in public transport terms, you know, well over a century. So, you know, we're confident that we'll be in a powerful position to bid for more of these funds as they come through.
And then your strategic review recommends pressing government for more funding and devolution of finance raising powers to help cover your funding gap identified in your financial modelling. Can I have an update how you're getting on with those discussions with government?
The first phase of the discussion with government was all about nailing the MOU regarding the Network Rail land.
Okay,
and
we
pursued that with DFT at very high level. Network Rail have played very honestly and straightforwardly by the MOU. All we need to do is nail the value and get on with it.
Okay, we're going to get on to land in a minute.
Okay, yeah.
It's the
but
financial
I mean that
modelling that it's in
yes,
your
but I was at great pains when I first took on this job to say that we shouldn't actually belittle the value of the MOU in terms of, I mean, that was effectively the only dowry that OPC had got. You know, there wasn't anything else. So I think the wider issue about persuading government to put more support into this, well, the HIF bid was the first stage of that. And I think if we are going to find that some elements of our HIF bid will come unstuck because of the of funding gaps, then we have to pursue discussions with other parts of government, with Homes England, with the Treasury. You know, there are pots of money around, but that's all sort of contingent on our working out exactly what we need.
And what about the devolution of finance raising powers? That was also in your strategic review. Have you made any progress on that?
Well, I mean that sort of I see that as part of the wider sort of funding for London argument.
Right, so it's
I mean,
not
certainly
something you're specifically pursuing, even though it's in your strategic review.
I am not pursuing, well, what I have been pursuing and what the team has been pursuing is discussions with the boroughs about how we might manage some element of the business rate.
Right, okay.
That has been slow going because, not surprisingly, the boroughs have a very strong view that they would like to use it all. And my view is rather, well, if there is going to be development there that we have prompted, then we ought to get a share of it.
Yeah.
I've always thought some element of business rate, enhanced business rate that arises from development ought to come back into the project. I have not pursued with government any further devolution of financial powers because I don't think I'd get very far because frankly the mayor's having that debate with them.
Okay. And how do you, just finally, there are clearly huge funding risks here that you're managing and so on. How do you communicate this with the mayor?
I meet David Bellamy on a regular basis. I can't remember, I think it's 2 or 3 weekly. Well, in fact, the chief executive and I and our chief finance officer go along and we meet David in company with Jules, also attends, and Mary Harpley, not called chief executive, is she chief officer. And then I meet the mayor as and when I need to, and I ask to have a session with him. And in fact, we're having a discussion with him probably sometime in the next week or so, just to discuss some of these broader funding issues.
Did you provide written briefings to David Bellamy on the risks you're managing?
Yes. And of course, Jules is a member of our board, the deputy mayor.
Okay.
Yes.
That's helpful, thank you.
Therefore, receives all our board papers, risk registers, and everything else.
Lovely, thank you.
Okay, before we move on, members, we've just been joined by children and staff from Manor Longbridge School in Barking and Dagenham. Hello to all of you. Hope you're having fun at City Hall today. Right, we're now going to move on and talk about the land ownership angle, and Assemblymember Berry is leading on that.
Thank you. So yes, I wanted to ask about, first of all, the public sector land. That's about 70% of the site. There was proposals for land transfer set out in the 2016 spring budget, and then the Memorandum of Understanding, to which you've already referred, with the Department for Transport, that mainly concern Network Rail land. Why has it taken so long to complete this when it's all just bits of the public sector?
Yes, I don't know is the answer. I must admit I've been quite frustrated that we haven't been able to nail this rather more quickly, especially since we did get, as I was explaining to Caroline, the DFT agreement that we should proceed to implement the MOU. I mean, I think there was always a slight concern that may be taken off the table. And I was very concerned that it shouldn't be, because actually, as I said, it was our only dowry. There was no other injection of public funding at that stage. There are one or two challenging operational issues. I mean, when you're talking Network Rail land, dealing with their land people is one thing. The land people then have to deal with their engineering people, who can always think of 50 good reasons why they need 3 inches of it to do something. I mean, sorry, I jest. It's all, I'm sure, very, very essential. But this Oaklands North site I was talking about, for example, that there was this issue of the operational side of Network Rail being absolutely clear about what bit of it they needed to retain in order to have this turning space for their lorries. I get deeply frustrated by the detail of that. I think partly, to be honest as well, our team got so focused on the HIF bid and spent such a lot of time and effort putting the HIF bid together that we possibly took our eye off the ball in terms of pursuing the negotiations with Network Rail. But David and I have picked up on those again recently, and have had or are having ongoing meetings with their head of property.
Okay, I mean, we have seen in other parts of the public sector, for example, the NHS, the hospitals, the mayor getting involved and there being quite a quick deal. I can understand what you're saying about the engineering issues being the key thing, because it is...
There's no excuse, really. I regret that we haven't been able to nail this as quickly as we should have done.
I mean, when it comes to, like, can we access a bit of track that we need to maintain... Those are details that need to be ironed out, and something where somebody ought to be wading into the detail, because it is, without that they're not going to sign off, are they?
I absolutely agree with you, and I think I think it's something we should have progressed more quickly, and something David and I are both conscious of, and would like to sort of crack the whip and get on with that now.
David, are you putting staff onto this? And also
meeting David Biggs, who's the head of property at Network Rail, as we speak, actually. So yes, this is a top priority for us. I think to be fair as well, I think the other issue has been that in the absence of funding, you know, maybe some people have taken the view that these issues are sort of slightly hypothetical, and because you can crack an MOU, but if you haven't got the money to buy the land, it's all sort of slightly meaningless. But I think Liz is right. I mean, it would be, I'd feel more comfortable if we were a bit further ahead than we are at the moment, but we're certainly engaging very directly.
I mean, there is also another practical difficulty, because the two sites we have our eye on, and which I would like to see progressed as rapidly as possible. The first is quite straightforward, subject to this turning circle. It seems to have taken a huge amount of time. The other one is the EMR site, the one with the metal recycling facility on it. And that is a complicated series of land interests, because even though it is Network Rail, there is a tenant on the site who still has a number of years left. EMR have about 11 years left, probably about 10 years left on the lease. Another party has an interest in that lease, and this is going to make this a quite complicated transaction. And you know, these sorts of things take a lot of time to unravel. The other party, I think it's perfectly public knowledge, so I may as well say so, is Queen's Park Rangers Football Club. You know, with a chairman who has views on what we should do about it. So it's not quite as straightforward as just buying it off Network Rail. We have to unravel some quite complex property interests there.
Okay, I mean, the sort of property interests and deal making, that's kind of high level stuff. What I was really asking with the staff was, you know, once you get down to the level of what's the turning circle and how do we get into this and this bit of the track, you need detailed people further down, don't you? You need a bigger team working on this if you're going to unravel the engineering issues. Yes, they are very practical, and they need that people.
And you need the people on the other side who can have the discussion.
Yeah, the high level people.
It takes a long time to get to the other people on the other side, because you know, Network Rail has its own hierarchy. So it has its land and property people who have to consult its engineering people, who, you know, that in itself appears to take a long time. I'm not blaming Network Rail, that's just the way, that's the way they work. Yes, I don't think the problem was in the detail. I think we just didn't have frankly, we just didn't, at the time we were putting the HIF bid together, didn't focus sufficiently on this with our people.
I mean, I'm saying this because, you know, as the Housing Committee, we've been talking to Transport for London about their issues with developing their land, and quite often that's adjacent to or overlaps with Network Rail, and we've talked about these specific issues, and they've got quite a large team trying to drill down on these issues, haven't they? So it's just, I'm just asking if it's been staffed well enough.
And it is interesting that the person who probably knew more about these two sites than anything went off to work for TfL, but as David said, has now come back to work for us. So hopefully she can pick this up as rapidly as possible.
I just have another point, because you know, I've got the scars to prove various engagements with Network Rail in London over recent years. And I think one of the real frustrations is that until you have, you know, quite a detailed development scheme, so you know exactly where your roads are likely to be, you know what your development plots are likely to be, you know what the building heights are likely to be, you know what your building over agreements need to look like in terms of getting over tracks and things. It's actually incredibly difficult to engage meaningfully with Network Rail, because what they will say is come back when you've got a scheme. And at the moment, of course, we don't have schemes. At the moment, we don't even have a firm agreement or decision about where our main road alignment's going to be, because that's still subject to consultation with landowners. We still need to finalise a decision with the board. So until we've got those things pinned down and we know exactly where the bridge over the canal is going to go and what impact that might have on the Network Rail land, in a sense, it's really very, very difficult, because Network Rail's operational teams simply will not engage. They will say, come back when you're ready. So, you know, I think, to be fair to the team, it's been a struggle to get that level of engagement in a meaningful sense, because we just haven't got our plans precise enough yet. And that's really what we're working to do now.
Does the delay in transferring the land create any further delays? Is there any... This all sounds very... things depend on each other in a way that seems...
I don't think that is actually an issue, because we've got so much planning to do for the infrastructure that you know, if and when we get to the point when we're ready to go, we will have sorted the land issue out by then.
Okay, and the money you need to spend on the land transfer,
Well,
that's time limited, isn't it? So that's the risk.
Yes, I mean, I always thought that actually it was quite a useful strategy to use some of the HIF money on land purchase, because in a way you're sort of banking it, because you can go out and buy the land, you spend the HIF money, and then when you sell the land later on, effectively you're recycling that HIF money, but that could be after 2024. You've got to have spent it by 2024. So actually land purchase is quite a sensible thing to do.
Yeah, but if you can't buy the land until you've made a detailed plan enough to go to Network Rail.
This incredibly, yes. But I am sure we could, we can bring to fruition some of the sites. I think there is an added complication on the AMR site because of the different property interests. But I still remain of the view that is a plausible way of proceeding.
Okay. I want to move on to talk about the car giant site, which has come up a couple of times. They seem to be rather digging their heels in now. They're challenging the CPO process. They're saying this needs to be stopped. They've said some things that are fairly... it's hard to see how they can be resolved about the fact that they cannot move to a new site now. Their window for relocation is closed, is kind of how they're putting that. What can be done about that? It's hard to see how you... I don't know if we can get into the sort of case, as it were, but it's hard to see how you can win a CPO if you're basically closing down that business.
I think, and David will chip in here, because we've spent a lot of time pondering this over the last sort of couple of months. I mean, at the point at which we put the HIF bid in, the proprietor of Car Giant was a willing supporter of what we were doing. He had always worked on the assumption that he would be able to relocate his business, that he would then master plan his own the development of his own site, and that master plan would fit in with our broader development. I think to be absolutely fair to Jeff Warren, he has discovered how difficult acquiring an alternative site for his business is. The values of strategic industrial land in West London, the rise of them has not hugely helped. He has come to the view, and I'm sort of putting words in his mouth, but this is what we understand. He has come to the view over the last few months that he no longer wants to relocate, that he'd rather just sit tight and run his business. Now, the line we have taken so far is that we would like to develop our Phase 1A and do it in a way that minimises impact on his business. That is a source of debate with him at the moment. We believe it is possible. He is saying it isn't. We are still working on that. I would like to believe there was an element of compromise possible. There is quite a lot of land in that Phase 1A that it indeed is in his ownership, but is used for a range of different purposes at the moment. So that is something we would have to work through, and I would like to think we would succeed in reaching a compromise on that. That leaves the bulk of his site, which we call Phase 1B, and it is quite clear he is not going to allow that to be brought forward for development, or he's not going to bring it forward for development himself. So I think we have to play a waiting game on that, because we're not prepared, we're not ready to do it yet anyway. An awful lot is going to happen about relative land values in West London over the next 10 years anyway. We don't know where an awful lot of things will be in 10 years, and I think provided we can crack on and work around the Car Giant ownership for the time being, we're sort of keeping our options open for the future, when values may be very different. And maybe at the very end of the day we do have to contemplate a compulsory purchase of his site, but again, by then values will be a lot different, because we will hopefully have a station in the south, we will have development in the north, and there will be this chunk of land in the middle that will look very different to what it does now.
So the cost of the CPO purchase would be higher in that circumstance. David, you're in charge of housing and land in London. Is there anything can be done with by talking to other landowners or assisting Car Giant, or just simply proving that they could move to somewhere else?
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't have an awful lot to add to what Liz says, because I think she's summarised it very well. I think it's very unfortunate that Car Giant have shifted their position. I think in some respects that's the biggest challenge that we have now. Car Giant is at the moment still a very viable business. And, you know, I think OPDC's got a difficult balancing act here because on the one hand, clearly our plans involve the car giant land coming forward in due course for residential and commercial development. But on the other hand, I don't think any of us want to see, you know, a large-scale business employing 700 or 800 people being extinguished. So it probably is a matter of a waiting game. On the other hand, I mean, you know, assuming that we do actually see a station developed here, which is, you know, going to be larger than Waterloo Station and carry similar numbers of passengers, I'm not sure it's easy to envisage, you know, 20 or 30 years after such a station being open and thriving, having quite so much land surrounding it occupied by a business that's buying and selling cars. That just doesn't really kind of feel like a sensible fit. So I think going back to Liz's point, in due course, it does seem to me those things will get resolved. In the meantime, because we actually do have some time to wait, our prime focus at the moment is unlocking the HIF money and getting phase 1A away. You know, I think we can play a bit of a waiting game and see where things move over the next few years. But in terms of your broader question, if I understand it, or your more direct question, can access to funding and resources from housing and land help to address some of these gaps and difficulties? The answer is yes, obviously it can. And I think, you know, we've got not only mainstream affordable housing money, but we also have not inconsiderable sums of money now allocated for, you know, land purchases, joint ventures and partnerships. So in actual fact, you know, in the other part of my life, you know, housing and land now has a budget which is almost double the £250 million of HIF, specifically to bring housing sites forward through land deals, loans and investments.
Yeah, but I mean, the point I was making was you're very aware of the land around London. I mean, you probably know every inch of it, I would have thought. Have you personally talked to car giants since you took over?
Yeah, I have. And I mean, you know, Jeff Warren, the owner, who I've got to know reasonably well, you know, he says it's actually very, very difficult to find 50-odd acres of land, contiguous land, to do the sort of things that he needs to do. He's right about that. You know, it's not easy to see 50 acres of land where you can do the kind of things that he needs to do with his cars. So I accept that. But I think, as Liz says, there may be opportunities in the future to, you know, look at different ways for him to organise his business. That's something that we're certainly interested in talking about. You know, he's got a very successful business there at the moment that's come together on the basis of, you know, acquiring, and I don't mean this pejoratively, but in an opportunistic way, a number of sites in a location which, you know, if you were starting from scratch, you might look to do things differently. You might be able to organise land a bit more differently. So I think this is a conversation that will evolve. So long as we can get the momentum behind our project, I'm pretty confident that there will at some point be a resolution to the car giant issue.
Okay, just finally to ask about, I know you mentioned it earlier on, Queen's Park Rangers. Can you outline what land interests they have in the area and what the current position is on the potential relocation of their stadium to?
But I think the answer to that is no, because I don't know what their current plans are on relocating their stadium. What I do know is it doesn't involve any OPDC land, and that's why I'm not party to their thoughts on that. My understanding and
can you outline what land holdings they have as well? I think you said they had part of the metal.
Not in totality, because I understand that they have a number of interests that, you know, are sort of, you'd have to burrow down into the land registry. They have got certain small sites in, you know, that are within our area, but they're not big enough for a football ground. So to some extent, I think what they've done is sort of bought up land as a, I guess it was a sort of either potential for a bigger land assembly piece, which didn't happen. So they've now still got interests in certain sites. I think they own a chunk of the Cumberland Business Park, for example. But as I say, you couldn't put a football stadium on that. So they are a landowner with a number of smaller sites. And then they have a particular interest in the EMR site in terms of a deal that they have done with the current occupant. Again, we are not party to the details of that deal. We just know it is a complicating factor in acquiring the site.
And Their current plans are potentially to just redevelop the Linford Christie Stadium. Do they own
which is not part of OPDC.
It's just
It's
below.
There's a
just
little
in
sort
Wormwood
of, yes,
Scrubs.
it's a little piece that's sort of chopped out of the bottom of it, and it is a site owned by Hammersmith and Fulham, who, as I understand it, have very firm views about what they want to see done with the site. So the negotiation is between Queen's Park Rangers and Hammersmith and Fulham. And as David said, thankfully that's one problem we don't have on our plate at the moment.
Okay, thank you.
Assemblymember Echelon.
Good morning. Apologies for lateness.
Good morning.
David, Liz, you mentioned both that the fact that discussions with Car Giant has been a bit productive, and you're trying to move forward. But the fact that we're nearly 3 years down the line, there's still no resolution on that land transfer, and both yourselves and Car Giant have spent a lot of money in looking at potential plans in terms of consultation, engagement with local residents, a number of money, public money being spent on consultants bringing forward a plan. And you mentioned, David, that access to funding will help push this forward. Mm-hmm. The current value for purchasing a CPO around Car Giant is around 600 million. Then all the additional canals, the bridges, and roads will be about a number of around 532 million. We know there isn't an endless pot to continue to try and purchase and CPO your way out of this. And some of the member Pigeon asked earlier, what is your plan B? What if all those discussions fail, all the negotiations fall through, you can't do CPO? What is plan B?
Well, the plan B is the waiting game I mentioned. We're not going to crystallise. Well, we cannot resolve this problem within the next couple of years. That, to my mind, is absolutely clear, because the proprietor of Car Giant has said he wants to stay put, and we don't have the funds to CPO him. I mean, the number you mentioned is probably pretty accurate in terms of extinguishing the business, which is why we want to work round him. So that, and over a period of 10 years, you will start to see a substantial change in values in the area, which may cause the proprietor of Car Giant to change his mind again. I mean, he's already, he started thinking he could develop. Maybe at some point in the future, when values are different, he will decide he will come back to the development table. Or, many things may happen in the next 10 years. In terms of both relative land values, car businesses. I am not an expert in the processing, because it's a big sort of car processing plant. I'm not an expert in what's going to happen to the car business over the next 10 years. So that, I think all we can do is play a waiting game and get on with what we can achieve around Car Giant.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, we're moving on to our final section now, which is around delivery. Assemblymember Cooper.
Thank you very much. So there's a number of different areas where you've said, well, we're not quite ready to talk about that yet, or Network Rail said, go away and come back to us when you actually have a scheme. But you have touched a few times on the fact that there are aspects of the delivery that you must be talking to other people about. So I'm assuming that you are engaging with potential delivery partners, even though we're still at the sort of planning stage of the process. And I wondered if you could say a bit more about that kind of engagement, and perhaps who you've been engaging with. You've mentioned Genesis Notting Hill. I assume there are others in the frame?
Yeah, and I'm glad you've asked the question, actually, because I don't want the committee to think that everything's a problem and nothing's happening.
What, so you're not just sitting around then, twiddling your thumbs?
Agonising, no.
I don't think we did think that, but
no.
Good to clarify.
Thank you. As Liz has already mentioned, we think there's an early opportunity to bring Oakland's North site forward, which is the piece of land that's owned by Network Rail at the moment, which is immediately to the north of the 650 homes that are on site with Notting Hill Genesis. Really, I think the big issue there is we need to finally nail down the alignment for our road and bridge across the canal, and that will then enable that site to come forward quite quickly. And that's maybe another 800 homes. There's no reason why that can't move relatively swiftly.
And so,
I think
who would you be talking to about those 800?
Well,
homes?
we're certainly talking to Notting Hill Genesis and QPR or Lansfield, which is the QPR property arm, because they're in a joint venture at the moment on Oakland South. Now, they're very keen to bring it forward. Whether it will be them or whether it will go to a wider market process remains to be seen. But I'm pretty confident that we can get those homes away relatively quickly. And then on the other side of the patch, if you like, the other end of the arc on Phase 1A, I think there's quite a lot of opportunities to get some early development in and around Scrubs Lane on the east of the site. And again, we know that the QPR property arm, if you like, has got some quite interesting land interest there, and they're keen to bring some early development opportunities forward, which will be a few hundred homes. And then to the south, we've also been talking to another developer interest with similar aspirations a little bit further south on Scrubs Lane. So, you know, there's no reason really not to be quite optimistic about the idea that we can't get, I would have thought, maybe a couple of thousand homes away, which are not entirely reliant on these big infrastructure challenges that we've spent most of this morning talking about.
So how attractive then would you say that the area is to potential developers beyond the select group that we've just mentioned? Obviously, the Mayor is looking for a high level of affordable housing on the site. And we haven't really discussed the condition of the site that much. Given its background, I'm assuming there's going to be some fairly serious ground remediation that's going to be required. So there will be some expensive matters that people, I would hope, would anticipate up front, although bizarrely the people developing the Battersea Power Station hadn't worked out how filthy the land around a power station might be, so that was more expensive than they anticipated. So there's going to be some expense, and there's also going to be, if you like, some value foregone because we're looking for affordable. Does that reduce the attractiveness of the site, or are you feeling confident you can get that 2K housing away with a selection of people sort of chomping to come and help you?
I'm pretty confident that those early win sites can move at the sort of pace that I've described, because although the area, let's be honest, is not the most attractive at the moment.
No, I think that's fair.
In a way, that's not unappealing for quite a lot of investors and developers at present, because there's an affordability point which is quite popular in the market. And, you know, Willesden Junction is not the most attractive railway station on the network, but it's a very, very good interchange. So, you know, access in and out of central London is very, very good. And so certainly all the conversations that I've had with potential developers recently on those early sites have caused me to feel quite confident. You know, they are, in the main at least, with the exception of Oakland's North, actually in ownership or option agreements, so they're pretty much ready to go. There's a lot of interest in long-term renting here. On the western side of our patch, we've got the Collective, which is this quite interesting, you know, small studios. Take a view about that, but it's proved to be quite popular.
Yeah, I know about the Collective because they're apparently wanting to do something in Earlsfield, which has actually created a bit of a stir that has not been entirely positive because of the size of the spaces involved. Shoebox was the word that was being thrown around in that. You know, I mean, there are ways of looking at this. So could you give us a clue then? How many developers have you actually spoken to now?
Well, I think let's broaden this out slightly, because David's listed the people with whom we are in active discussion. I mean, on Scrubs Lane, in fact, two of the developers already have a planning permission. They've been through our planning committee, you know, with the agreed level of affordable housing. Now, the slight problem is they haven't started building them, and that's, you know, actually pushing them to that point. Right over the other side of our site, on the other side of Park Royal, we've got Fairview, who are doing a substantial development of, somebody will help me with how many thousand of homes going to be. It's a very big site.
On the Diageo site.
Yeah, on the Diageo site. Over the course of the summer, last summer, in sort of preparation for our HIF bid, we have done a lot of what we would call soft market testing, and the development team, you know, went out and met a substantial number of developers. I don't think I should list them.
No, but maybe give us a clue on numbers, even without.
Well, they must have spoken to 8, 7, 8, 9 developers. I attended some of the meetings. Some of those developers, regularly ring me up and say, what's happening, can we have an update? And I shall certainly be showing them one or two of our sort of indicative sort of plans and numbers to see whether we can get them interested in coming in and sharing the risk. So, there are plenty of people out there, big institutions, developers.
Following back after the soft market testing, so they're coming back.
They email us and bring us up everything. So how's it going? Are you ready to talk with something a bit?
So there is tougher appetite there to work with yourselves and move this forward, even though.
When they've had a closer look at the numbers, some of them might find it challenging. But yes, this is seen as this is an opportunity area.
It is an opportunity.
It's called an opportunity area for a reason, because the industry.
But we have also touched
opportunities.
I did mention the fact that there's a risk in the sense of the level of ground remediation that will be required, and examining the ground is always one of those things that at this stage people probably haven't done huge amounts of ground investigation. And there's also the reduction in terms of return on investment because of the social housing, if you want to look at it in that way. So there's risk both from the side of the OPDC, which David's already mentioned, de-risking and joint ventures and innovative investment vehicles and so on and so forth, but obviously from the developer side. So is there any thought about joint ventures to de-risk from both sides in that way, or other vehicles that you might be looking at?
I think all possibilities would be on the table, and actually this is where having David with his experience of the Homes for Londoners programme and his housing and land team there, they're very familiar with lots of different ways of actually cutting this. So yes, we are not ruling out any possibility, and the idea of joint venture with some degree of risk sharing is a very attractive one. I'm just sort of looking to Jasbir, because she sort of sits in the office and would know what. I mean, the Oakland South site, I'm not aware that they had big contamination problems on that.
No, they didn't.
I mean, they've sort of gone on, they've cracked on. I'm sure you've been down there and seen. They're already very well advanced, and I would hope the Oakland's North site, that's a logical extension of that, I don't think that's got quite the same history. I think the EMR site will be interesting, although Lansfield tell us that they've done exploratory work there, and it's not. I mean, I take all that with a pinch of salt, but yes, of course you've got to have that in mind, and that's always a risk when you're developing brownfield land.
Of course. And so in terms of, we were talking earlier, I think it was Assembly Member Bacon who was asking about additional staff coming in at this point to help with the planning consents and this stage of things. Do you feel, and this might be one also to bring Jasbir in on as well, do you feel that you've got the capability and capacity to deliver the project in terms of the investment side of things? Or will you be looking to bring in more people to assist Jasbir with what she's doing?
Well, it's a good question, and I think to some extent it's going to depend on the route that we finally end up taking, because I think this goes to your last question as well. I mean, in my experience, broadly speaking, you can do big, complicated regeneration projects like this one of two ways. I mean, there are lots of ways, but crudely two ways. You can do it a bit like the Olympic Delivery Authority did Stratford in the Olympics, which was very much public sector led, very large budgets, preparing the land, buying the land, and then creating, effectively service development plots, which the private sector and others then take. Or you can work very early on with third-party private sector or sometimes housing association interests in joint ventures and partnerships, which is probably closer to the sort of model that we've used in Barking, Riverside, Royal Docks and elsewhere. And I think, one of the very interesting questions here is, given the money and the risk that we have here, is it necessarily the right thing to try and do the kind of ODA approach? Or actually is it more sensible to try and do something which brings a partner in to help to share risk early on? If we were to go down the second route, then I think some of those issues about the kind of capability and experience that we need inside the OPDC team may look quite different, because actually, you'd be assuming that quite a lot of that would come from your partner.
Your partner.
and that's why I think at the moment my mind's open. I think we need to come to some conclusions about that pretty quickly. But as I think we've been discussing most of this morning, we have a project which, okay, it's not as big as the Olympics. Let's not pretend it is. But some of the challenges are almost as complicated, and we don't have the billions of pounds of public money that were available back in the early 2000s or the mid 2000s.
Two quick points then. One, you're saying your mind is open now, but we do need to decide soon. How soon?
Well, I would have thought, my time horizon on this is we've got a local plan process which is probably going to run through to the early part of 2020. We will know, I think, by, the early part of next year, whether the planning inspector agrees that our plans should proceed, at least at a strategic planning level. I think,
okay, so probably in the next 9 or 10 months then we're talking?
Yeah, I think alongside that process, we need to refine our thinking, because we need to nail the HIF issues, we need to get the GLA comfortable. We should obviously, I hope, assume that we get a positive outcome on the local plan, and then we should be ready to go. So my time horizon on this is that we need to, I think, agree our investment development procurement strategies during the course of this calendar year.
So that's my second question, because you just mentioned the GLA, and you said at the moment your mind is open, but is your mind completely open, or is there any imperatives that are flowing from the current cash flow and borrowing situation of the GLA that are impacting on the decisions that you might be making at OPDC, in the sense that the GLA has been taken on borrowing for other purposes? Does that have an impact at all?
Well, I think so, yeah. I mean, I am minded to think that if you look at those cash flows and you look at the fact that HIF is capped out at 250 million, and you look at the GLA's, if you like, meta position on borrowing and risk, then it does look to me as though we need to look pretty carefully at whether we need some third-party sharing of that risk and additional investment to come in on terms. Now, I think that may require some public sector support as well, and as I've said, there are various investment funds that potentially can be tapped. Often it's easier if those investment funds in other parts of the public sector are tapped by non-public sector organisations. So I also think there's another aspect of this that interests me, is that we really ought to have the confidence that there is going to be a level of serious market interest in this early on. That's almost a kind of litmus test for the project. I think that's another reason why we might at least want to explore the option of bringing partners into this early on.
So we've talked a bit about the sort of private sector partners. What have you been talking to TfL as well, for example?
Oh, TfL have been, in lockstep with us on this project, because we've talked a lot about Network Rail, but yes, TfL have huge interests here.
Yeah. Okay, so they're part of the picture as well, because obviously part of the GLA family, so they would be very much part of any partnership arrangements that you finalise. Okay, thank you very much. Finished.
Assembly Member Pigeon.
Yeah, in terms of delivery, again, in your strategic risk document, it's marked as red, the 50% commitment to affordable housing. And I think it says in that the OPDC needs to rigorously challenge developer viability assessments and draw on the support of a new expert team based at City Hall. So I'm wondering who is funding this new team? What is this team? How is it functioning, and is it helping you to get to that 50% affordable housing on the sites that are coming forward?
I think that's probably a reference to the viability team in the Planning Directorate, which was recruited, I don't know, a year, 18 months ago. And they do have a lot of experience and expertise at interrogating viability appraisals and, squeezing the pips on affordable housing. But as you know, OPDC in its draft plan has a very clear commitment to working to achieve 50% affordable housing. We don't think that that's necessarily going to be achievable in the early phases, and we've been very honest about that. But we have, as we've already heard, got policy compliant levels of affordable housing on Oakland South, and we will certainly be looking to achieve the same on the early development sites.
I think across the board of the planning permissions we've already given, we've got about some 39% affordable housing. So the 50% is indeed the aspiration in the local plan, but given the conditions and everything else, our own planners have done very well in driving a sensible level of affordable housing.
So is your planning team drawing on this new central team somewhere at City Hall? Which is what it says in, I'm quoting from your OPDC risk document.
Yeah, I mean, certainly where there are major applications that are, referable to the mayor, I mean, we wouldn't normally engage the team, obviously, on the very minor applications that come in, but anything with any substance to it, our planning team in OPDC is in dialogue with Julie Emma McLaughlin's team here at City Hall.
To try and maximise the
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Right, we've reached the end of today's session. Members, can we note the report on today's discussion and delegate authorities to me as chairman in consultation with party group leads to agree output from today's meeting?
Agreed.
Can we also thank our guests for their attendance and contributions this morning? We've got a couple of other very quick items, we'll just whiz through them. The Budget and Performance Committee work programme is item 6. Can we note the work programme? Item 7, dates for the next meeting. It's scheduled for the 11th of July, Thursday the 11th of July at 10 o'clock in here. Item 8, any other urgent business? There isn't any, so the meeting is closed.